Welcome to Empowered by Illness, a podcast about living with genetic disorders. Episode 2, I'm Unique. I always knew I was unique, just not this unique. I have had medical issues since I was a small child, some of which were detrimental. Others just fun tricks. I would sit in the W position almost all of the time. I also absolutely love doing backbends and showing off my talents to everyone. At the age of 4, I went deaf in one ear and partially deaf in the other. Since then, I have had 7 surgeries altogether for ear, nose, and throat issues. From childhood, I had dislocated joints, mysterious bruises, awful depth perception, major pains in the legs to the point of crying in agony, GI issues, and so much more. All of my ailments were either chalked up to growing pains or just put through medical treatment without a second glance. To be fair, most medical professionals did not know to look for certain symptoms or to put them together, and I have multiple genetic issues, so who could have predicted that? I'm a 37-year-old mother of 2, a 14-year-old daughter, and an 11-year-old son. In June of 2021, I found out that I have 2 genetic disorders. One is called Fabry disease, a lysosomal storage disorder, and the second one, hypermobility Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a connective tissue disorder. In simpler terms, Fabry disease is a disorder where your body doesn't filter certain types of fat and proteins properly. For example, instead of fat and proteins being pushed out into my body parts in order to use them for energy, my body builds up the fat and proteins inside of my internal organs, which can cause heart failure, kidney failure, among other major problems. It can also cause major ear, nose, and throat issues and gastrointestinal outcomes, as well as other major medical inconsistencies with the body. This is a rare genetic disorder. Unfortunately, my son and I both have been diagnosed with this disease through genetic testing. On to my next lovely disorder. Sarcasm is definitely a defense mechanism for me. Hypermobility Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a connective tissue disorder, which means it affects your whole body in tons of negative aspects. Our connective tissue makes up our organs, skin, everything is connective tissue. Therefore, this disorder affects every part of the body, much like Fabry disease. I am about 98% sure that my daughter has hypermobility EDS, but because it cannot be detected in a genetic test, but has to be diagnosed with merely symptoms, it is hard for her to get a diagnosis for that. They also recently changed the criteria for children with hypermobility EDS, so that's another reason it's difficult to get a diagnosis. As of now, they are diagnosing her with hypermobility spectrum disorder on top of other comorbidities. Fabry disease was not even on my radar. I had no idea what a lysosomal storage disorder was. And if you don't know what that means, even after I've explained it briefly, I encourage you to go look it up because it's quite intriguing. Also sort of hard to wrap your mind around, which is exactly what happened to me when I found out I had this disease. So through many different steps and many different doctors, I've been through 8 neurologists, 4 rheumatologists, 6 primary care physicians, and this is just from the age of 30 until now, all in order to find my diagnosis. When I received my final diagnosis of genetic disorders, after my rheumatologist sent a referral to the geneticist, I don't want to hand out names because I didn't get permission from these doctors to put them in my podcast. So I will just refer to them by their specialty, as in rheumatologist, geneticist, PCP, things of that nature. The geneticist did genetic testing for any other EDS. There are 13 subtypes of EDS, and I had all the symptoms of classical Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So we did the genetic testing. He used a company called GeneDx, which I loved, and they're very thorough. I recommend them if someone is getting a doctor to help them with their diagnosis while using genetic testing. They are amazing. If you are not getting a doctor to help you with genetic testing, I recommend Invitae. I got my daughter some of her testing done through them. You do not need a doctor's referral. GeneDx, unfortunately, has to have a doctor's prescription or referral. It had been 5 years of fighting with symptoms that were gradually getting worse, so the anticipation was gut-wrenching. My symptoms got to the point where I had to use a walker sometimes. It was horrific, and I cried all of the time. I was in so much pain. I was trapped in my own body, and I was very good at hiding it from people who loved me, from people who lived outside of my house. Nobody knew how severe my symptoms were until they had seen them in person. So it was a long, difficult battle, which is the most simplistic way to put it. It is a long, difficult battle, and I will call it a battle because I fought harder than someone trying to get air while drowning. When I received my diagnosis, I remember I was sitting on my toilet with the lid down, basically hiding from my family, not wanting to hear what was about to come my way. I knew we would find something with genetic testing. This lovely doctor, and I mean that literally, he's a great doctor, he proceeded to tell me, good news, you do not have classical EDS. All of your EDS testing came back negative. You could tell something wasn't right, so I asked him if there was something else, and his response was, yes, I have bad news. Also, we found something we weren't looking for. So as I sat there, as this man was telling me I have a disease I've never heard of in my entire life, and it only affects a limited amount of people, that it is rare, and that it usually only affects men, women don't have symptoms. We'll come back to that later. As I sat and tried to soak this in, he started using his emergency response voice and continued to tell me I have to get my children checked immediately, that there's a 50-50 chance they will have this rare disease also. He wants me to come in to check my heart function, my kidney function, to make sure that I'm not going into kidney failure or heart failure anytime soon. I soaked it in about as much as I could, which was about the length of my pinky, because I didn't understand what Fabry disease was or what pathogenic meant. How could all of this be the cause of my symptoms? Because according to him, a lot of my symptoms could not be caused by Fabry. That's not what it does. That turned out to not be true. A vast amount of my symptoms comes from Fabry. Hypermobility EDS, or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, affects your joints, muscles, internal organs, eyes, ears, etc., etc. So my muscle weakness, my joint swelling, the damage to my joints, all of that has to do with EDS, unfortunately. At least that's what we know from research. I don't know if my neuropathy is caused by Fabry or EDS. I have tingling in my hands and feet, hot and cold intolerance. Those are symptoms of both diseases. The lines blur which comes from which. So back to soaking in both of my diagnoses. Once he told me the news, I got off the phone. I cried alone in my bathroom, contemplating what this meant for our family. I started to do extensive research on Fabry disease and what it can cause, and also how it affects men to a certain age. They would die at the age of 45 was the last thing I read while sitting in my bathroom. This is something that definitely stood out to me. So I cried. I cried because I finally found answers. I cried because I was worried for my son. I was scared he would not be able to grow up and live his life. Up to this point, I had already been struggling with his medical issues since he was 5 years old. He was 9 by the year of my diagnosis, so it had already been 4 years long that we had been struggling with his medical illnesses, trying to figure out where the dots are connected to him. So it was definitely the biggest double-edged sword. On one hand, I received something I had been searching for years, fighting tooth and nail, being exhausted to my soul, breaking down, crying, being in pain, and wondering what the next symptom would be. Would I go into a coma? What would happen next? The severity of my symptoms continued to escalate and scare the hell out of me. But not only was it me, In this period of time, I watched my children's health deteriorate. My kind-hearted son was sick constantly. He could not get out of bed. Some days, he was in massive, agonizing amounts of pain to the point of crying. He had hot and cold intolerance, tingles in his hands and feet, and body aches and pains. GI symptoms to the point of incontinence, as well as ear, nose, and throat issues. He has had ear surgeries every year since he was 5 years old. He's now 11. Just all of it, and trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together for not only me, but for him was soul-crushing to say the least. Soon followed my daughter's medical fight. She started to pull muscles when bending or stretching. Stretch marks started to show literally all over her body. She would not be able to carry her own body weight, and her legs would continue to swell and discolor at the slightest amount of pressure or exercise, or even if she's just laying in bed. My sweet girl would be in agonizing pain almost daily. Now, I'm watching my children fight just to be children. To be able to live and not be able to help them is literally torture for a mother. To see your kids not be able to function as children and to be in immense pain on a constant basis. They can't get up, run, play, enjoy themselves is the most tortured feeling, in my opinion. My symptoms are nothing compared to watching my children be helpless. Once I process my genetic testing results as well as possible without a medical degree, and after the sheer shock of how our lives were going to be forever more off, I realized at least we can help him with some kind of plan. I tested both of my children, which opened up a whole new can of worms. Being unique isn't a bad thing, or so they like to tell us. But for my family in particular, it is definitely the hard way to live or survive. I can probably go on and on for hours on this subject and what has occurred since the first time I wrote this. Instead, I will just continue to do my podcast. Thank you for listening. Please like and follow for future episodes. Feel free to type in the Q&A information if you have any more questions. I'm completely open to being asked as many questions as possible. I do apologize for the delay in this episode. I had a double ear infection and while I have my tubes in, so I had some bleeding in my right ear and could not use my headphones. So I really appreciate your patience. Until next time, never give up, never surrender. When subscribing to Empowered by Illness, you are not only spreading awareness of genetic disorders and chronic illness, but helping our family with medical bills and everyday necessities. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for subscribing to Empowered by Illness.